There's a decision point that exists in almost every aviation emergency, a moment where the crew must choose between two fundamentally different courses of action. Continue away from trouble to gain altitude, time, and options, or turn back immediately to the familiar safety of the airport you just left. It's a decision that's been debated since the earliest days of flight. It's a decision that's killed hundreds of pilots. And it's a decision that, based on all available evidence, sealed the fate of everyone aboard the aircraft carrying Greg Biffle, Dennis Dutton, and Jack Dutton. The choice to turn back, made in the heat of an emergency with limited information and enormous stress, set in motion a sequence of events that would prove impossible to reverse. Today we're going to examine exactly why that decision, which seemed so logical in the moment, was almost certainly the wrong choice, and why continuing straight ahead or climbing away might have resulted in a completely different outcome. Before we can understand why turning back was fatal in this specific case, we need to understand the general aerodynamics and physics of why the turn back after engine failure is so dangerous in any aircraft. This isn't unique to jets or to Citation specifically. This is a fundamental problem that applies to any multi-engine aircraft, from small piston twins to large jets, though the specific performance characteristics vary. Let me walk you through what happens when you attempt to turn back after an engine failure at low altitude. When you take off, you're building energy in two forms: kinetic energy, which is your airspeed, and potential energy, which is your altitude. Together, these represent your total energy state. Every aircraft has a specific amount of energy at any given moment based on its speed and height. This energy can be converted from one form to the other. You can trade airspeed for altitude by pitching up, or trade altitude for airspeed by pitching down. But you cannot create new energy. You can only work with what you have plus whatever your engines are adding minus whatever drag is taking away. When an engine fails, you suddenly lose a major source of energy addition. You're no longer adding energy at the same rate. In fact, you might not be adding energy at all. You might be losing energy because the drag from the failed engine plus the drag from the asymmetric flight configuration might exceed the thrust from the remaining engine. So from the moment of engine failure, your total energy is either staying constant at best or decreasing. Every second that passes, you have the same or less energy than you had before. Now, here's what happens when you turn around. Turning requires bank angle. When you bank the aircraft, you're tilting the lift vector. Part of your lift is now pointed horizontally to turn the aircraft instead of vertically to support the weight. To maintain altitude in a turn, you need to produce more total lift than in straight flight. More lift means more induced drag. More drag means you're bleeding energy faster. So turning costs you energy. The tighter the turn, the steeper the bank, the more energy it costs. Additionally, if you don't add power to compensate for the increased drag of the turn, which you can't do if you're already at maximum power on your remaining engine, you're going to lose airspeed. As airspeed decreases, you're converting kinetic energy into the work of turning. But here's the trap. In a banked turn, your stall speed increases. At a 30-degree bank, stall speed increases by about 7%. At a 45-degree bank, it increases by nearly 20%. At 60 degrees, it increases by over 40%. So you need more speed to avoid stalling in a turn, but the turn itself is bleeding away your speed. This creates a deadly convergence. You're losing airspeed because of the turn. You need more airspeed to avoid stalling because of the bank angle. And if you try to maintain altitude by pulling back on the yoke, increasing angle of attack, you're increasing drag even more, which bleeds speed even faster, and you're getting closer to the critical angle of attack where the wing will stall. At low altitude, if you stall in a turn, you're almost certainly going to enter a spin, and you won't have the altitude to recover. The result is a smoking hole in the ground. This scenario has killed so many pilots over the decades that it has a name. the impossible turn. Not because it's literally impossible under all circumstances in all aircraft, but because for most pilots, in most aircraft, under most conditions, shortly after takeoff, attempting it is fatal. The statistics are brutal. The majority of pilots who attempt to return to the runway after losing an engine shortly after takeoff do not survive. They stall in the turn, or they run out of altitude before completing the turn, or they misjudge the approach and impact short of the runway. Now let's apply this general understanding to the specific circumstances of the Biffle flight, because the Citation has particular characteristics that make the turn back even more problematic than in some other aircraft. The Citation is a jet, which gives it certain advantages over piston twins. Jets generally have better thrust-to-weight ratios. They can climb faster. They have more excess power available. But the Citation, particularly the older 500 series models, has relatively limited single-engine performance, especially at high weights. When you lose an engine on a Citation at maximum gross weight, at low altitude, your climb performance is marginal at best. You might be able to climb at 200 or 300 feet per minute if conditions are perfect. You might not be able to climb at all. You might actually be descending slowly, even at full power on the good engine. This depends on weight, on temperature, on altitude, on configuration. But the point is, you don't have enormous performance margin. You're not climbing at 2,000 feet per minute anymore. You're barely maintaining or slowly gaining altitude. Now add a turn to that equation. When you bank to turn, you lose some of that marginal climb performance. You might go from climbing 200 feet per minute to descending 100 feet per minute just from the energy cost of the turn. And if you bank more steeply to make a tighter turn to get back to the airport faster, you lose even more performance. A 45-degree bank might put you in a descent of 300 or 400 feet per minute, even with full power on the good engine. Based on the available ADS-B tracking data from the Biffle flight, the aircraft appears to have climbed initially to approximately 2,000 feet, then leveled off, then begun maneuvering back toward the airport with multiple altitude changes. 2,000 feet. That's not much altitude. That's maybe 90 seconds to 2 minutes before you're on the ground if you're descending at a typical single-engine descent rate. That's barely enough time to complete a 180-degree turn and line up with a runway, much less set up a proper stabilized approach. And the weather that day made everything worse. Ceilings were reported at 1,200 feet broken, visibility 5 miles in drizzle. These are marginal VFR conditions. You're operating right at the edge of instrument meteorological conditions. Visibility is reduced. Cloud bases are low. When you're maneuvering at low altitude, trying to find the airport, trying to get visual contact with the runway, you don't have clear horizon references. You can't easily judge your altitude above the ground or your distance from the runway. It's very easy to misjudge, to think you're higher than you are, to think you're closer than you are, to think you're lined up when you're not. In weather like this, the smart choice, the safe choice, is to be on an instrument approach with electronic guidance, with glide slope and localizer or GPS guidance telling you exactly where you are and exactly what descent rate you need. But to set up for an instrument approach takes time and altitude. You need to be high enough to intercept the approach course, to get configured, to get stabilized on the glide path. From 2,000 feet in marginal weather, trying to make a tight visual pattern back to the runway, you don't have those options. Let's trace through what the decision to turn back committed the crew to. The moment they decided to return to the departure airport instead of climbing away, they committed to a compressed timeline. No time to climb to a comfortable altitude. No time to run complete checklists methodically. No time to set up a proper approach with all the briefings and preparations. They had to turn, had to maneuver, had to try to find the runway visually in poor weather, had to get configured, had to get lined up, all in the space of a few minutes at low altitude. And here's where the decision cascade begins. When you're low and trying to make the runway, you feel pressure to configure for landing. You need to get the gear down, get the flaps out, get ready to land, because you're running out of time and altitude. But configuring early, extending gear and flaps while you're still maneuvering and uncertain whether you'll make the runway is incredibly dangerous on single engine because of the massive drag those components create. We have direct evidence from the cockpit voice recording, from the radio transmission that was captured, that the crew extended the landing gear. Listen to this audio. This is Jack Dutton making a position report. Took off runway 10. We've got an issue here. We're getting everything going. We're getting our gear down. We're getting our gear down. They're extending landing gear. And the implication from the context is that this is happening while they're still maneuvering, still trying to get back to the airport, not on a stabilized final approach. This is early configuration, and in a Citation operating on one engine at high weight, extending the landing gear is a commitment you can't take back. The Citation manual explicitly states the aircraft cannot maintain altitude with gear down and flaps extended on one engine at maximum weight. Once that gear comes down, you're descending. The only question is whether you have enough altitude to make it to the runway. Now, contrast this with what should have happened according to established procedures and best practices. When you experience an engine failure shortly after takeoff, the recommended procedure, the procedure that's taught and practiced and proven to save lives, is to not turn back immediately. Instead, you continue straight ahead, or turn only slightly, no more than 30 degrees or so, while you climb. Your goal is to gain altitude, to get to 3,000 or 4,000 feet minimum. At that altitude, you have time to run checklists, time to diagnose the problem completely, time to set up autopilot, which can fly the aircraft safely on one engine, time to declare an emergency with ATC and coordinate for vectors to an appropriate airport, time to brief an approach, time to make sure both crew members understand the plan, time to configure at the appropriate point on a stabilized approach rather than early while maneuvering, and critically, at altitude, you have options. If the first approach doesn't work out, if you're too high or too fast or the lineup isn't good, you can go around and try again. You have fuel for multiple attempts. You can take your time and get it right. But when you turn back from low altitude, you get one chance. You have to make that approach work because you won't have altitude or time for another attempt. There's also the question of where to land. The Biffle aircraft departed from Statesville Regional Airport, a relatively small general aviation airport. The longest runway is around 4,500 feet, which is adequate for a Citation under normal circumstances, but doesn't provide much margin with one engine and an emergency situation. Charlotte Douglas International Airport, a major hub with runways over 10,000 feet long and complete emergency response capabilities, was only 32 miles away. Think about that, 32 miles. The aircraft traveled 26 miles during the 10-minute sequence from takeoff to crash. If they had climbed to altitude and headed toward Charlotte, they could have made it easily. They could have had a runway more than twice as long, with fire trucks and ambulances and emergency medical services standing by, with air traffic controllers providing vectors and guidance, with weather that might have been slightly better at a larger facility. Every possible advantage. But the decision to turn back immediately committed them to returning to Statesville, to the small airport, to the short runway, to attempting a visual approach in marginal weather at low altitude with minimal margin for error. Once that decision was made, all those other options disappeared. They were committed to making Statesville work. Here's what makes this even more tragic. There's a possibility, we don't know for certain, but based on the flight track, it's plausible, that the crew initially tried to line up for runway 10, landing back in the same direction they'd taken off. But when they descended, trying to get visual contact with the runway in the poor weather, they realized they were too high and too close. They couldn't make that approach work, so they had to abandon it, had to maneuver around for a different approach, which is why we see that large sweeping turn in the flight track. That abandoned approach cost them altitude and time and energy they couldn't afford to lose. If they had been higher, if they had more margin, they could have gone around and tried again, or set up for a different runway from a proper altitude. But from low altitude with limited performance, abandoning one approach and setting up for another ate up their remaining margin. By the time they were lined up for runway 28 on the final attempt, they were too low. They didn't have enough altitude remaining to make it. The evidence shows they impacted 1,800 feet short of the runway threshold, 1,800 feet, at a normal approach speed of around 110 knots. That's about 10 seconds of flight time. They were 10 seconds from the runway, but those 10 seconds required altitude they didn't have. If they had been 500 feet higher at that point, they would have made it. They would have landed. Everyone would have survived. But they weren't 500 feet higher. They were at the altitude they were at because of the cumulative energy cost of all the decisions that had been made since the engine failure. The decision to turn back instead of climbing away. The decision to maneuver at low altitude trying to find the runway instead of climbing to where they had time and visibility. The decision to configure early instead of delaying gear and flaps until certain they could make the runway. Each of these decisions bled energy, cost altitude, reduced options. Now, I want to address something important here. It's very easy in hindsight, sitting comfortably on the ground with unlimited time to analyze, to say what should have been done differently. It's much, much harder in the moment, in the cockpit, with alarms going off and warnings flashing and one engine destroyed and low altitude and poor weather and stress and adrenaline. The instinct to turn back, to get back to the familiar airport, to get the airplane on the ground as quickly as possible is overwhelming. It feels like the safe choice. It feels like the conservative choice. And for Dennis Dutton, with decades of experience flying large airline jets, where single-engine performance is much better, where you have more power and more options, the expectation might have been that the Citation would perform better than it actually could. Large jets can fly quite well on one engine. You can climb, you can maneuver, you have capability. A Citation at maximum weight on one engine has marginal performance at best. If Dennis's mental model of single-engine capability was based on airline jets, he might have expected more performance than the Citation could deliver. Additionally, we don't know what information the crew had in those first moments after the failure. If they didn't immediately understand that they'd lost an engine, if they thought they had some other problem that might get worse, if they were uncertain about the extent of the damage, the urgency to get on the ground would have been even stronger. We won't know what they understood and when they understood it until the NTSB releases the cockpit voice recorder transcript. But regardless of the reasons, regardless of the understandable human factors that drove the decision, the fact remains that the decision to turn back immediately instead of climbing away is what sealed their fate. That decision put them on a trajectory, literally and figuratively, from which recovery wasn't possible given the performance limitations of the aircraft. Let me give you a scenario of what might have happened if they'd made a different choice. Engine fails shortly after takeoff. Pilot maintains control, maintains airspeed, continues climbing straight ahead or with only shallow turns to avoid obstacles. Climbs to 4,000 feet. At 4,000 feet, engages autopilot. Autopilot maintains heading and altitude on one engine. Pilot not flying runs the engine failure checklist completely. Shuts down the failed engine properly. Reconfigures systems. Pilot flying declares emergency with Charlotte approach. Requests vectors to Charlotte Douglas. ATC provides vectors and altitude assignments. Crew coordinates with ATC for an ILS approach to a long runway. Crew briefs the approach, discusses configuration plan, confirms both understand the plan. Aircraft vectors to intercept the ILS at a proper altitude. Gear and flaps extended on short final once the runway is assured. Aircraft lands on a 10,000-foot runway with emergency services standing by. Everyone walks away. Aircraft is probably repairable. The whole sequence takes maybe 20 or 30 minutes from engine failure to landing, but everyone survives. That's the outcome that following the recommended procedure would likely have produced. But that's not what happened. What happened was an immediate turnback, low altitude maneuvering, early configuration, compressed timeline, no margin for error. And when a small misjudgment of altitude or distance occurred in the poor visibility, there was no altitude left to correct it. The outcome was impact short of the runway. The aviation community has known for decades that the turnback is dangerous. There's extensive research, accident data, analysis showing that it kills pilots regularly. There are recommended minimum altitudes for even considering a turnback, typically at least 1,000 feet, but preferably much higher. There are recommended techniques if you absolutely must attempt it. Specific bank angles, specific speeds, specific procedures. But even with perfect technique, it's risky. And in marginal conditions with limited performance, it's often unsurvivable. The question is, why pilots keep making the same choice that's killed so many before them? And the answer is psychological. The airport behind you is known. It's safe. It's where you just came from. It's familiar. Continuing away from it, climbing away from safety, feels wrong even though rationally it's the better choice. Your instinct says turn around, get back, land now. And unless you've trained extensively to override that instinct, unless you've internalized through practice that climbing away is correct, you'll follow your instinct when the emergency hits. This is why recurrent training is so critical. This is why simulator sessions exist. This is why we practice emergency procedures over and over, so that when it happens for real, when the adrenaline is pumping and the alarms are blaring and you have seconds to decide, your trained response overrides your instinct. You do what you've practiced, not what feels right in the moment. The lesson from this tragedy, the lesson written in blood that we need to learn and internalize, is that the turnback is almost always the wrong choice. Climb first. Get altitude. Get time. Get options. Then make decisions from a position of safety and strength, rather than from desperation at low altitude. That's how you survive. That's what saves lives. If you're a pilot watching this, especially if you fly multi-engine aircraft, I'm begging you to internalize this lesson. Discuss it with your co-pilots. Brief it before flights. Establish personal minimums for when you would even consider a turnback, and make those minimums high, much higher than you think you'd need. Practice the scenario in a simulator if you have access to one, and commit now, before the emergency happens, that if you lose an engine shortly after takeoff, you will climb first and turn back later, if at all. Greg Biffle's decision to turn back sealed his fate and the fate of his two companions. We can't change that outcome, but we can learn from it. We can make sure the next pilot facing the same decision has the knowledge and the training and the mental preparation to make a different choice, a choice that leads to survival instead of tragedy. If this analysis has been valuable to you, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with other pilots and aviation enthusiasts. The more people who understand why the turnback is so dangerous, the better chance we have of preventing the next accident. Thank you for watching. Fly safe. And remember, altitude is life.